All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the final round of Big Questions debate, a debate format supported by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. This year, students have grappled with complex worldview questions as they debate both sides of the topic resolved objective morality exists. Tournaments and classrooms that hold Big Questions debates are eligible to receive thousands of dollars per event throughout the school year. Thanks to the generosity of the John Templeton Foundation, the NSDA has given almost $1.5 million to speech and debate programs across the country since 2016. We're excited that the foundation will generously support Big Questions for another 2 years, creating continued opportunities for students to debate topics at the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology. You can host a Big Questions event at a tournament, school scrimmage, or classroom event. Please visit nsdabigquestions.org to find out more information. Thanks all for joining us today. At this point, I will turn the round over to Head Judge Tanya Roundy to get started.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Congratulations to our competitors. Is everyone hearing okay and speaking okay? Everyone's video's working?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yes.
This is a side-locked round. Are our judges all ready?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, this is a side-locked round, and so our affirmative will be Q122. Amy, is Scott still introducing our competitors, or are we just going on?
I'll introduce the competitors after the round.
Oh, okay, excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, all right then. So we don't have a coin flip, and we are ready to get started. So whenever you are ready, Q122.
Great.
Can you do
Sorry?
Can you do a mic check real quick just to make sure we can all hear you okay?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Everything good? Great. Okay. Before I started my speech, I just wanted to give a couple thank yous. The first is to the NSDA and the board for everything they do for speech and debate on our community, and especially for moving the tournament forward with everything going on right now. I know it's probably a big move to change everything from like Albuquerque to online, but it's really important to us to be able to use our voice now more than ever. Secondly, I'd also like to thank the John Templeton Foundation, obviously, for their generous investment in this activity, which allows Big Questions to be a lot more accessible for all teams across the nation. I think Big Questions is a great debate event, which allows students to answer, well, big questions. And I think it's a different debate event from traditional events, as it allows us to use different fields of reason to prove our arguments. Thirdly, I'd like to thank my school's administration, Flintridge Prep, our principal who's leaving this year, Mr. Bachman, Miss Cooper, who looks over the team and allows us to go to tournaments. They've done a lot for us to go to different tournaments all throughout the year and help us succeed. Fourth, I'd like to thank my coaches, Nicole, Isaac, Maggie. They all do a great job of not only teaching us important skills on how to be a debater, but also making us better people and being great people to be around. Specifically for Big Questions, I want to thank Coach Khamani, who spent countless hours just teaching me different arguments and making sure I understood stuff, and my teammate Ashwin, who is competing in Worlds at Nationals, but still decided to text me at midnight and make sure I'm understanding what I'm saying. I also like to thank my teammates, all the boys in the council. You guys know who you are. Everyone on the prep debate for supporting me. It's been a long journey to get here, and sometimes, you know, it seemed tough and hard, but the team was always there for me. Lastly, I'd like to thank my family, obviously my sister who's going to college this year, and my mom and my dad. I know they're downstairs, but they're still supporting me by, you know, not talking or not screaming or like making me food in between rounds. Those are all great things that they're doing. And lastly, again, I'd just like to thank all the adjudicators, the judges, for spending their time on helping students succeed in activities such as high school debate and giving us their input to improve. With that said, is everyone ready for the affirmative case? Great. Morality is rooted in the purity of every single one of our hearts. Mahatma Gandhi. It's because I agree with Gandhi that I strongly affirm the resolution resolved. Objective morality exists. Firstly, I offer the following definitions to structure this debate. Merriam-Webster defines objective as being independent of individual thought and perceptible by all observers. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines morality as a code of conduct that, given specified conditions, would be put forward by all rational persons. Objective morality should be seen as any universal, easily observed, and impersonal intrinsic trait to humans. Next, Cambridge defines exists as to be known, recognized, or understood. With these definitions in mind, I have one observation. The burden of the affirmative is to prove that A, there's a code of conduct that is perceptible to all observers, meaning that everyone is able to notice this universal moral, and that B, these morals would be put forward by all rational persons, which means that one person not following them does not disprove their existence. Remember that the affirmative only has to prove that there is an objective moral that exists, not that all morals are objective themselves. With that in mind, my first contention is a biological basis for morality. In 1975, evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson founded the science of sociobiology by stating the time has come for ethics to be removed from the hands of philosophers and biologicized. Thus, all prove that Wilson has been thoroughly vindicated by advances in sociobiology, and that morality's biological basis leads to its objectivity in two ways. The first is subpoint A, which is the evolution of altruism. In evolutionary biology, an organism behaves altruistically when its behavior benefits other organisms at a cost to itself. Professor William J. Fitzpatrick finds that altruism is a central aspect of morality, and the American Psychological Association notes that experiments have proven that altruism is a universal behavioral trait in all humans in every culture. This can be explained biologically through kin selection and reciprocity. The basic idea of kin selection is simple. Imagine a gene that causes its bearer to behave altruistically towards its own blood relatives. Since the recipient of the favor is related, it likely also shares a copy of the same gene. Thus, the gene boosts the fitness of other individuals with the gene, which results in natural selection increasing the abundance of that gene in the population. The overall effect of behavior is an increase in the incidence of altruism. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy concludes by noting that the importance of kinship for the evolution of altruism is very widely accepted today on both theoretical and empirical grounds. Furthermore, evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers found that altruism between unrelated individuals has its basis in reciprocity, where the cost of helping is offset by the likelihood of the return benefit. Finally, the Journal of Human Evolutionary Sciences concludes in a detailed study that despite small variation, altruism is a universal human trait. Thus, it is clear that altruism, one of the core pillars of morality, is objectively grounded in human evolution. Subpoint B is the moral core. Altruism, the core pillar of morality being a genetic trait universal to all humans, can be confirmed by the presence of a common objective morality, also called the moral core in all babies. Yale psychologist Paul Bloom notes that at birth, babies are endowed with compassion, empathy, and the beginnings of a sense of fairness. It is from these beginnings that adults develop their sense of right and wrong. Confirmed by experimentation, neuroscientist Jean Desity summarizes research on infant morality, where young children provide comfort and assistance to those in financial distress. For instance, 18-month toddlers show comforting behaviors to their mothers in pain. At just 3 months of age, infants prefer interacting with puppets that behaved in a nice way than in a negative way. And by 12 months, infants understood fairness, expecting an equal number of cookies to be given to all people in a room. While the expression of this morality can vary at older ages, Desity notes that these tendencies are the foundation of human morality. Contention 2 is the moral sense in neuroscience. Nicholas Baumard, a research scholar at the Department of Cognitive Sciences, explains that in recent years, a range of studies from fields such as neuroscience, psychology, and anthropology have shown that humans are equipped with something scientists call a moral sense that is biologically programmed to identify moral situations. Francisco Ayala from the Department of Evolutionary Biology finds that humans have a moral sense because their biological makeup determines the presence of conditions necessary for ethical behavior. While there may be slight variance in different societies due to cultural norms, the scientifically proven big picture shows that all humans possess this identical sensor. Darwin put it best when describing moral behavior as a, quote, biologically determined human universal, but with culturally evolved differences. Having proven that there are morals that are universally expressed in all humans through a genetic and evolutionary basis, we urge you judges to support humans as a species who care and thus are very proud to affirm.
Okay, so before my speech, I would just like to extend a few thanks. First, I'd like to thank the Templeton Foundation for sponsoring Big Questions and providing this unique opportunity to discuss these overarching issues in society. Biology, psychology, and ethics are some of my favorite topics, so it was truly a joy to research these areas, and I uncovered some ideas in literature that really changed my conception of morality. Big thank you as well to the NSDA for putting together this opportunity to host nationals despite the trying times with COVID-19. I'm really grateful for this opportunity and appreciate how smooth and well-organized the tournament was despite it being online. I also want to thank my coaches, Mr. Holland, Mrs. Leito, and previously Mr. McCaffrey and Ms. Moreno. I wouldn't be where I am without their effort and guidance. Of course, I also want to extend thanks to my family for being so supportive of my debate career. Even though it requires a lot of time, effort, and investment, they've been always supportive of me and encouraged me to pursue my passions, which is why I'm here today. And to the Plano West speech and debate, you guys are amazing. Thank you for being great teammates during highs and lows. The community that we've established is one of my favorite parts of debate. Special shout out to Shruti, Lillian, Alyssa, Angela, Aditya, Michael, and Renee for being great friends inside and outside debate, and to Daniel for helping me prep on this topic. Without further ado, I'll move on to my case. Is everybody ready? I negate. Objective morality exists. Let's begin with some definitions. Oxford Dictionary defines objective as not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. According to Bernard Gert, a professor of intellectual and moral philosophy at Dartmouth, morality is defined as a code of conduct that, given specified conditions, will be put forward by all rational persons. Therefore, my opponents must prove that a system of morality exists, rather than pointing to specific examples. Contention 1 is cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is defined as the Carnegie Council for Ethics as the view that ethical and social standards reflect the cultural context from which they are derived, not any universal or objective morals. Examples of cultural relativism are prevalent in the world, as Jia finds that the concept of moral identity is culturally biased, and although some concept of moral identity exists in all cultures, it functions in different ways and at different levels in each place. Moral identity is a context-dependent construct that is tied to varying social and cultural obligations. Morality's meaning frequently shifts over time as well. Nick Haslam finds that values such as care, compassion, and safety are more important to us now than they were in the 1980s. Meanwhile, the importance of respecting authority has fallen since the beginning of the 20th century, while judging right and wrong based on loyalty to country and family has steadily risen. My second contention is neuroscience. Francisco Ayala, evolutionary biologist and philosopher, writes that humans have a moral sense because their biological makeup determines the presence of 3 necessary conditions for ethical behavior. One of these conditions is the ability to advance value judgments or to perceive certain objects or deeds as more desirable than others. Clearly, these values are subjective because determining what is desirable is a matter of personal preference. That means if human morality is tied to values, it cannot be objective, but rather subjective. Mole supports this idea in the journal Nature with neuroscience. He writes that morality emerges from the integration of cortical limbic networks. And critically, one of the components of this brain network is the limbic structures that correspond to motive and emotional states. As such, while moral cognition depends on knowledge and information, morality would be reduced to a meaningless concept if it were stripped from its emotional aspects. For example, when someone is hurt, central motive states elicit anxiety and attachment, which encourage you to help the suffering person. This emotional element demonstrates how morality is inherently connected to personal feelings, thus making it not objective. Mole continues that the concept of antisocial personality disorder, otherwise known as psychopathy, originated from individuals who show a pattern of behaviors that go against the common good and repeatedly evolve harm towards others. The neurobiological validity of psychopathies is supported by imaging studies that reveal abnormal brain activation in limbic regions which control emotion and motivation. This suggests that, among other factors, that people with psychopathy experience different moral emotions. In fact, Cardinal finds that judgments about how fear-causing statements would make oneself feel were significant predictors of psychopathy. This finding is consistent with a large number of previous findings that psychopathy impairs the ability to recognize or empathize with others' experiences of fear, and suggests that failure to understand fear as a negative experience in its own right leaves them blind to the moral consequences of behaviors that cause others emotional distress. Thus, morality as the biological phenomenon that it is inextricably linked to subjective emotions and feelings, which means it cannot be objective. My third contention is the utilitarian problem. In attempting to achieve an objective morality, many philosophers turn to some form of utilitarianism. However, this system includes intrinsic flaws that exclude it from being objective. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, utilitarianism is the view that the morally right action is the action that produces the most good. Specifically, when making a moral decision, one measures an action's value with respect to pleasure and pain according to the following: intensity, duration, certainty, proximity, fecundity, purity, and extent. This is extremely problematic because every single one of these elements is a subjective evaluation. For example, there's no way to objectively measure the intensity or purity of pain. Wire from the APA writes that a smiley face scale is currently the best tool that researchers and doctors have to determine how much pain somebody is in. Similarly, duration of pain is impossible to predict. It's not impossible that two similarly healthy people contract a disease and one recovers with no long-term side effects while the other dies within months. All in all, pleasure and pain remain subjective experiences that cannot be objectively evaluated in terms of probability, endurance, intensity, and more. Thus, a morality based on these experiences is inherently subjective. I strongly urge you to negate. Are you ready for crossfire?
Yes. Is it okay before we start if I have the first question?
Go ahead.
Great. We'll start time now. Let's talk about your third argument about utilitarianism.
Okay.
Utilitarianism is a theory that was invented by one philosopher in the 18th century. Why should the affirmative be held to a specific theory that we don't endorse?
So when you talk about altruism, aren't you talking about increasing pleasure in other people or decreasing pain?
No, the altruism is not an argument about pleasure or pain. What science defines goodness is whatever helps humans survive, because the main goal of any organism is to survive and reproduce. Thus, things like altruism, which help species survive across all species, are considered good. This is different from pleasure and pain connected to survival.
Okay, so
my question is still that if utilitarianism justifies things like slavery because the majority is in the good, why should we be forced to use that framework?
Okay, I'm not saying that you're forced to use this framework. However, if you're going to evaluate what is good for people and what is not, isn't that some form of utilitarianism? Because it's based on consequences, right? But anyways, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Okay, so when you talk about evolution, if I'm able to demonstrate that different moralities were selected for by evolution, does that mean that it's not objective?
Well, what do you mean by different moralities? Because we define goodness as a neurological construct in science that is defined as anything that helps that species survive.
Okay, so what is this neurological concept? If it's like specifically in the brain, isn't that pleasure?
No, it's nothing about pleasure. What you have to keep in mind is that goodness is defined as anything that helps a species survive in science. That's an objective truth. Therefore, things like altruism, which are good because it's the reason humans have survived from 200,000 years ago to now, are considered objectively good. Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. You talk about neuroscience, right? And you talk about how like psychopathy and stuff like that. Are people who have antisocial personality disorder fundamentally rational people?
Yes, they are. They don't have any kind of intellectual disorder.
I know, but why are they considered rational persons?
Because they have reasoning, like they are rational people. Like they're able to make rational decisions. They don't have any kind of intellectual impairment. It's solely an emotional impairment. Can I ask you?
So psychopathy is explained by emotional impairment?
Yes, that's what my case says. Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay, so when you talk about how morality, an objective morality is independent of thought and perception, how can this be true if morality stems from thoughts? Like it's not something that we can see or measure in the universe. Yeah,
obviously morality isn't measured in things like gigawatts, but what we do measure morality is, again, this idea of goodness in science, anything that helps us survive. What I mean by my definition about independent of individual thought means we can't let things like emotion affect something for something to be objective. So like we can't say, I think this is good and that's why, but when it's proven through science that it helps an organism survive, then it can be objectively considered good.
Can I have a follow-up
Sure.
though? Okay, so how are we measuring this goodness?
Anything that helps an organism survive. There's no like a number for morality.
Okay.
That's great. I'll start running prep time starting now. Okay, that was 25 seconds for me. And is everyone ready? Cool, it's just gonna be going down the negative case. And we'll start the time Now, studying our definition of objective, I'd argue that the affirmative is already fulfilling this burden because science, by definition, is already objective. It's not scientists saying what they think is right, it's conclusive results. But then she also talks about how we have to have a system of morality. I'd argue that science is already a system that can judge morality. For example, the Oxford Learner's Dictionary defines science as knowledge about the structure and behavior of the natural and physical world, based on facts that you can prove, for example, by experiments. My opponent stated that I have to prove a system of morality exists. Seeing as science is the knowledge of the structure and behavior of the natural and physical world, this would meet that burden because the structure is the type of system. Meaning, as long as I prove that morality exists within the field of science, we meet this burden handedly, and you should be voting affirmative. But let's talk about her contention one about cultural relativism. She makes two arguments here. The first is that morals change from culture to culture, and the second is that morals change over time. But what we're not denying is the fact that, again, remember, for you to vote for the affirmative, all we have to show you is that there is unobjective moral, not that all morals are objective. What that means is that objective morals can coexist with subjective morals, meaning that she can prove to you this entire round that there are subjective morals that exist, and I won't deny that, but that doesn't change the fact that there are a fundamental set of morals that humans genetically have. It's important to remember that yes, humans do evolve consciousness, which is why we thought that slavery was right, but now obviously think it was wrong. But what stays the same throughout all of human species from 200,000 years ago to now is things like the evolution of altruism, things that help humans as a species survive. This is going to be important because she can win if you agree with every single word she says. It still doesn't give her the ballot because remember, subjective morals can exist, but it doesn't change the fact that under that cloud of subjective morals, there's a fundamental core group of morals that will exist for all humans in every culture. But the second argument here is that remember, we have to agree to the fact that the definition of objective moral is three things. One, it's observable. Two, it's universal. And three, it's impersonal. All my arguments prove that because again, science is universal because all humans are genetically hardwired the same. We simply have cultural differences. But second, it's impersonal because scientists are not stating their opinions, they're stating facts. And again, third, it's observable because all the studies I'm citing are observable facts, such as the reason that we have altruism is because it's helped us survive, or such as the fact that just 3-month-old babies are able to show morality. There's another response to this argument, and the response is that at just 3 months of age, I'd argue babies aren't affected by things like cultural norms. If I'm 3 months old, I'm not going to be knowing the difference between living in America and living in the US. That doesn't affect morals, such as that fairness exists. Babies understand that everyone in the room should get the same amount of cookies. That means things like cultural norms wouldn't be affecting that. On her contention too about neuroscience, she misses a fundamental argument here. Yes, the moral sense can be used to make emotional decisions, such as what should I do in this scenario? But fundamentally, the moral sense was created so we can survive. That is why it's in our brain. The moral sense's simplest decisions are things like what is good and bad for my survival. That is why we use the moral sense on the affirmative to prove that that's make the decision, such as that altruism is a good thing, or I should do this in order to survive. Remember, the definition of goodness and rightness and morality is proven through science as anything that helps an organism survive. That means that things like altruism, which have helped us survive, are inherently going to be objective morals. She talks about psychopathy. There's two main responses here. The first is that Elisa Oltoa writes that individuals with antisocial personality disorder are explosively irrational individuals, which means they don't even fit the definition of rational persons creating this. But second, according to neuroscientist Pascal Walsh, there are environmental factors that create psychopathy. It's not something they're born with. It means that psychopaths and people with antisocial personality disorders still have the same moral core that is in all humans. On our contention 3 about the utilitarian problem. First of all, the affirmative never endorses utilitarianism because utilitarianism endorses things like slavery because it says, well, the majority isn't being harmed, so slavery is a good thing. This is just a philosophy that's created by one scientist. I'd argue this does nothing to prove us wrong. It simply says that there's a philosophy like this that would agree. But also, she says that pain is subjective, but studies now prove that pain can now be observed as an objective feeling. Essentially, even if she wins everything about saying that there are subjective morals, you'd still be voting for the affirmative because we prove that subjective morals and objective morals will always be coexisting.
I'll take running prep. Okay. So as a brief off-time roadmap, I'll be going down my opponent's case and then coming back to defend mine. Is everybody ready? Okay. Starting on my opponent's first definition, which is of objective, independent of thought or perception, this doesn't make a lot of sense because morality is an abstract concept. It exists only in our thoughts, so obviously we cannot observe them independent of our own thoughts and perceptions. It makes more sense to default to my definition provided by Oxford, which is objective is defined as not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. We both agree on the Stanford definition, which is that morality is defined as a code of conduct that will be put forth by rational persons. Recognize, however, that this contradicts one of his observations, that it doesn't mean that just because one person doesn't follow it, that it is not objective. All people must inherently agree to this because this code of conduct is put forward by all rational persons, and that's the affirmative's burden to prove. Then my opponent goes on to say that this code of conduct is fulfilled by the affirmative case because he provides science. However, not only, we should look at what exactly a code of conduct means. It's a system that guides behavior in an objective manner. That's what he's trying to advocate for. Therefore, underneath this system, you should be able to objectively evaluate actions. That's problematic because it goes back to the problem of utilitarianism. Even if he's advocating for what's exactly good for survival, that could be really subjective depending on the person. What's good for one person's survival may be extremely harmful to another. For example, if you gave insulin to a person with diabetes, it would save them, but if you gave insulin to somebody without diabetes, they might die. You can see that what's good for survival is subjective between individuals, and so there's no objective way to evaluate actions. On his two subpoints, however, on his first contention, where he talks about how evolution contributes to our sense of altruism as well as the common moral intuition, I'd argue that the mole evidence completely disproves this by demonstrating psychopathy. People that are affected by psychopathy are not altruistic and do not have the same moral intuitions because they commonly go against the common good. This is because they have a different biology that leads to a different system of morality. Specifically, they have abnormal brain activations that lead to a lack of recognition or empathization with emotions in other people, and so they don't have any problem causing fear or perhaps harming others. This is problematic because it's a different sense of morality. However, clearly, psychopaths still exist. There are 1 million people in the United States that qualify under psychopathy, and you can see that after tens of thousands of years of evolution, people who are not altruistic but rather selfish are still selected for by evolution. They can still continue their bloodline. This demonstrates that not all humans have the same sense of morality, and not the same sense of morality is picked by evolution every single time, thus demonstrating that it is not objective. But further, I'd argue that even if you buy into evolution, it is not a rational consideration of whether something is good for our survival that actually controls morality, but rather personal emotions. This is found through evidence according to Haddett. Negative moral judgments were given to offensive yet harmless actions, such as cleaning one's toilets with the national flag. In fact, emotional reactions to an action were better predictors of moral judgments than perceptions of harmfulness. This makes sense because when we're making moral judgments, it's not like we're going through complex calculations of whether or not this is going to increase the survival of the human species. We're going to default to our personal emotional judgments, which is what people do. You can see that what is harmful and what is perceived as harmful is less important than how people feel according to empirical studies. But let's go back to my case specifically on neuroscience. All he says is that psychopaths do not qualify under the definition of a rational person because they're explosively irrational. However, that is just merely rhetoric. Let's look at actual definitions. According to Gert, who provides the same definition of morality, a code of conduct that will be put forward by all rational persons, he specifically defines rational persons as people who have the intellectual as well as volitional ability to understand morality and use it in their judgments. People with psychopathy are not intellectually impaired. They can understand morality as a concept, and furthermore, they have free will, so they also have this volitional ability. This demonstrates how they are rational agents, and yet because of their differences in biology, it results in differences in moral conducts. So we can see that it varies from individual to individual. Therefore, if different people consider certain things to be moral and others consider it to be immoral, then that is a clear piece of evidence demonstrating how objective morality simply does not exist. Thus, I urge you to negate.
Okay, are you ready for cross? Great, you can have the first question, starting now.
Okay, sure. So if evolution selects for different moralities, doesn't that mean that it's subjective because it's differing from individual to individual?
Wait, evolution does not select for different moralities.
It does, because if...
It does not.
Okay, so can you tell me, proof that? Because I demonstrate how psychopaths have an entirely, different sense of morality, but they still exist after tens of thousands.
Yeah, but what you didn't respond to was the second response I made, which was that psychopaths are made from our social norms rather than our morals, or rather than genetics. Because,
Wait,
well,
what evidence backs that up?
I read evidence from neuroscientist Pascal Wallish. I can give you the evidence later. But essentially what it proves is that, the same moral core exists in psychopaths than it does in any other person. Because at 3 months of age, babies are already showing signs of morality where they're not affected by cultural norms. And because psychopaths are affected by these cultural norms, it doesn't disprove the fact that objective morality exists. Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, again, you talk about this idea of like the utilitarian problem, right? Right?
Yeah.
Right? So like, again, why should this be accepted or why should it be evaluated anywhere in the round?
Because you're saying that what is good promotes the survival of a species, right? So you have to find some kind of way to evaluate that. If you evaluate it by consequences, isn't that utilitarianism?
No, the argument is that goodness is a universal neurological structure in humans whose function is to assist survival. It's not that each human comes up with their own thing. It's genetically rooted in our genes. You make this argument that like, well, when every time I make an action, I'm not thinking about whether I'm going to survive or not. And I'd argue, yes, that is true because genetics are subconscious. I don't control what my hair color is going to be. These are things that are inherent to all humans. So I'm not thinking about whether I'm going to survive or not when I pick up a pencil.
Okay, so you're like telling me that this objective way to evaluate what is exactly good for survival and not exists, right? And
Yes.
you're telling me that it's from the neurological structures, okay? So like what evidence backs that up, considering that for doctors and researchers, like the best tool that they have for determining how much pain somebody is a smiley face scale, which is very subjective.
Well, that's not true. I read evidence saying that, so Carl Saab, I cited this evidence, but Carl Saab's a professor at Brown University, and his colleagues recently came up with something called an EEG, also known as an electroencephalography machine, which is essentially a graph of the human brain, and it can tell whether someone is in pain or not. So pain is in fact objective.
Okay, can it determine intensity of pain?
Well, I would argue that your own argument proves the affirmative true. Saying that everyone experiences pain is a universal moral because one, it is impersonal because pain is something biological, and two, it is observable through this objective way of looking at pain. So to argue that you arguing that everyone is experiencing pain proves the affirmative true. It doesn't matter how long this pain is. The fact that everyone experiences it makes it true.
Is that cross?
Yeah, it's like 5 seconds left. I used 25 seconds last time, so I'll just continue running prep starting. Okay, is everyone ready? Good. All right, great. It's going to be starting on the burdens / definitions, and then down the affirmative, and then down the negative. I'll start at the time now. On the burdens, the first thing that she says is that morality is abstract, so we can't observe it. But the thing that she didn't respond to is the fact that science is a system in which we can judge morality definitionally, based on the fact that goodness is, again, a neurological thing created by science that defines things as either right or wrong based on how it leads to survival. Of course, science can judge an abstract thought like morality. For example, the evolution of altruism proves goodness true because altruism is good as it's allowed our species to survive for the past 200,000 years. She said all people must agree on it, and she cites psychopaths, but I would agree that not all people have to agree to something for it to be true. For example, we know the earth is round, and that's an objective fact. Just because people say that there's a flat earth doesn't prove the fact that the world is round scientifically. Again, because it is scientifically proven, it doesn't matter if some people don't agree with it. It's genetically rooted in all humans. Then she says that it's a code of conduct and that survival is subjective. I'd argue, no, this is not true because when I pick up a pencil, I don't think, is this decision going to make me survive or not? The argument is not that. I'd argue that the moral sense argument, which she did not respond to in her last speech, helps us make these primordial like decisions. For example, these simplest decisions, whether will this help me survive or not, are made through the moral sense. For example, compassion and empathy are the reason why humans have survived for so long. Those are subconscious. Those are in our genes. We're not going to be thinking about it. So just because people can think about survival in different ways doesn't disprove the fact that survival is inherently something that is good. On my sub-point about evolution of altruism, she just says that we have psychopaths. But again, she doesn't respond to the idea that psychopaths are created based on our environment. It's not based on their genetic code. That means that things like our environment are influence them, which is a subjective moral. Remember the idea that a subjective moral and objective moral can coexist. The only thing she did in her last speech is prove that subjective morals exist, but she did not prove that objective morals do not exist. That is the burden of the negative. They have failed to do that. At that point, yes, there can be outliers. Yes, there can be people who disagree about certain things, but it doesn't change the fact there's a fundamental core in all humans that stays the same because we're all genetically hardwired the same. She doesn't respond at all to my subpoint B about the moral core. And this is going to be very, very crucial because it proves all her subjective morality arguments wrong. Remember, it says that at just 3 months of age, people are understanding things like fairness, where everyone expects to get a same amount of cookies in a room. That means that cultural norms won't have time to affect babies who are 3 months old, which proves that at the end of the day, when you subtract all the cultural differences, all the morals changing over time, there's a fundamental moral core that stays the same in every human. You can also easily vote off the moral sense of neuroscience. This was completely uncontested in her last speech. What this tells us is the moral sense is biologically programmed in every single human being and allows us to make value judgments that help us survive. This is the thing that helps us say that altruism is a good thing because it helps us survive. This is things that's saying that selfishness is a bad thing because it doesn't help us survive. Looking at her case, remember, at the point where you extend the definition that an objective moral is something that is 1, observable, 2, universal, and 3, impersonal. Science proves all of that true. When the fact that she's conceded that science is the system for judging morality, it's easy to vote for the affirmative. Remember, that subjective morals do not mean that objective morals do not exist. And the fact that every human is genetically hardwired the same with cultural differences proves objective morality true.
I'll take prep.
You used like 230 last time, right? Okay.
Okay. So I'll just be going down the affirmative and then coming back to the negative. Is everybody ready? Okay. On the definition of objective, I'm not contesting whether or not science can evaluate morality. What I'm saying in response to this definition is that morality is an abstract concept that is a product of our thoughts. And so it can literally not exist independent of our thoughts and perception, which is why it's more rational to look towards my Oxford definition, telling you that objective is defined as not influenced by personal feelings. If you combine that with the Stanford definition, which is morality defined as a code of conduct that will be put forward by all rational persons, what the affirmative needs to prove is that there's a code of conduct that will be put forward by all rational persons and is not influenced by personal feelings, but they fail to do so. What they talk about is this code of conduct and how it can be evaluated by science, but they don't give you an actual system upon which you can evaluate actions, which is what a code of conduct definitionally is. They can tell us that pain is bad all day long. However, that is not enough upon which you can build a system to evaluate actions specifically. For example, is it better or worse to give 10,000 people a headache versus breaking one person's legs? In order to actually be a code of conduct that is objective, you need to come to an objective conclusion on these specific actions because that's what the definition is proposing. However, my opponent has no way to do this because once again, he's provide no objective way in which you can actually evaluate what harm is worse or what pleasure is better. But then specifically when he talks about this moral core, recognize that I'm not talking about how this moral core is like influenced by cultural norms. I'm talking about how it's influenced by emotions, and emotions differ from person to person, making it subjective. Not everybody has the same moral core, as the mole evidence tells us that people with psychopathy are not altruistic and they don't have the same moral intuitions as us as a result of different biological features in their brain. There's abnormal activations that result in them having a different sense of morality, and they don't have a problem going against the common good. This demonstrates that there's no common moral there's no common moral core among humanity, and evolution has selected for two different moralities, demonstrating that all moralities are inherently influenced by feelings and they all coexist. There cannot be a single objective morality. Then on his third contention, he says that I don't contest it, but we cite the same evidence. I'm just telling you in my case why it's specifically going to be a negative argument, which is why you can move on to neuroscience from my case. What Ayala tells you is that the reasons why humans have morality in the first place is because they can advance value judgments. These values are subjective, as Moll tells us that morality emerges from the cortical limbic networks in our brain that are specifically associated with emotional states. It causes us to feel certain things towards moral actions, which is why we determine them to be moral or immoral. As I demonstrated through the Hadith evidence, this morality and this feeling is more important than the actual perception of harm. So you can see that we're not making some kind of moral calculation that has to do with whether it increases survival or decreases survival. We're just defaulting to our emotional instincts. And therefore, as I tell you, psychopaths can be considered rational agents under the definition proposed by Gert. This demonstrates that if you change these moral emotions just a little bit through these abnormal brain activations, it leads to an entirely different sense of morality because there are different moral emotions involved, or should I say, a lack of moral emotions. As a result, you can see that there is no objective morality because it's always influenced by personal feelings. I strongly urge you to negate.
I think I have about 2 minutes of prep time left. I'll start running that now. Okay, is everyone ready? Good, all right. Let's start on the definition of what it means to be objectively moral. Again, there's 3 parts to this. 1, that is universal, 2, that is impersonal, and 3, that it's easily observable. She never disputes any of these 3 facts, and because science proves all of these true, we'd argue that morals that help us survive are objectively true. On her case, she drops her contention 1 and her contention 3 and goes really hard for this neuroscience argument. She makes 2 claims here. She says that we make all judgments are subjective and we default to our emotions. But this doesn't explain things like the moral core, where 3 months where babies have still not developed emotions and she hasn't provided evidence that babies have, they still show a sense of morality. In fact, babies develop emotions when they are 3 years old. So if at 3 months old, they're already understanding things like fairness and understand that everyone should get an equal number of cookies, that already means that the moral sense and the moral core is not dependent on cultural norms or not dependent on emotions. In her next speech, she's going to make the claim that every single decision we make is emotional and subjective. That is not true. Again, we affirm that yes, there can be a coexistent space between subjective and objective morals. We never deny that throughout the entire debate. But our narrative is that yes, this cloud of subjective morals can exist, but fundamentally, in the middle, there's a group of norms that always stay the same throughout whole humans. She just references psychopaths, but there's 2 arguments to make here. 1, she still hasn't responded to the idea that psychopaths are formed based on their environment, which is an effect of cultural norms rather than the genetics. But the second argument is that psychopaths would probably also want to live, which means that they are also part of this universal moral of humans trying to survive. Now let's start on my case. She says that morality is abstract and it can't exist independent of our thoughts, but that construes the definition. What all these definitions are trying to say is that we shouldn't let emotions affect an objective moral. For example, I shouldn't just say killing is bad because I think killing is bad. I need to prove that. It's not saying that morality is completely abstract. That's why you see through the definition of objective morals. If it is observable, then it is an objective moral. And because science is completely observable, because all these studies prove that the reason humans have survived as such a dominant species for 200,000 years is because we work together, we cooperate to ensure our survival, despite any cultural differences. The only other response in our case, she talks about harm and pleasure, and we need to create a system in which you can evaluate this. But again, the goodness system, which I talk about, how something is right or wrong, is based on how it leads to an organism's survival. The claim that has gone undisputed this entire debate is that the goal of any organism is to survive and reproduce. So it does not matter if someone is a psychopath or not. They still want to survive and reproduce. That is how we are made. It doesn't matter if you consciously let your emotions affect this. Subconsciously, our genes work without our consent. Subconsciously, humans want to survive. That is why species survive. Our main goal is to survive and reproduce. She talks about harm and pleasure. We never agree to setting a harm and pleasure as their standard. Again, our only standard here is that anything for survival is good. Things like altruism is good, but you shouldn't let things like emotion say like, well, if I get a paper cut, is that good for my survival? It's not things like that. It's things that are scientifically, objectively proven. People don't get to make statements that this helps them survival or this doesn't. Remember, in her next speech, she's going to say two things. One, that all our judgments are made on emotions, and two, that everything is subjective. Remember, the claim that subjective and objective morals can coexist in the same place has gone unrefuted. That means that because humans are genetically hardwired the same, despite any subjective or cultural differences that may exist, we are all the same. For that reason, I would urge you to affirm. Thank you.
I'll take the rest of prep. Okay, so I'll just go down my opponent's case and then come back to mine. Is everybody ready? Okay. At the end of the round, my opponent concedes the definition of objective, which is going to be not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. If you combine this to the definition of morality, which is a code of conduct that will be put forward by all rational people, you can say that we have to prove that there's a code of conduct proposed by all people that is not influenced by personal feelings, and this simply isn't true. He argues how science can prove what exactly is right or wrong. However, once again, I tell you that people don't do this like complex evaluations with how much it's going to increase their survival versus decrease their probability of survival, how it's going to increase the probability of the species survival, or anything like that. Rather, they automatically defer to their emotions. He never responds to the hadith evidence telling you that what is considered what the moral emotions in response to actions are a better predictor of moral judgments than what is actually harmful. Therefore, you can see that emotions are more important in considering this code of conduct, and therefore it is subjective. Once again, he talks about this idea of a moral core, and specifically he cites 3-year-olds. However, I answered this. I said that it's not influenced by cultural norms, but rather by emotions. I would argue that obviously babies develop emotions immediately when they're born. They're born knowing how to cry when they feel bad. And so this demonstrates that emotions are an inherent part of human psychology. And once again, he doesn't respond to them all evidence, demonstrating that psychopaths have a different sense of morality as a result of their different biology. They are not altruistic, and they do not work towards the common good. They do not cooperate. However, they were still selected for by evolution, as there are 1 million in the United States alone. This demonstrates how there's different perceptions of morality based on an individual to individual, and all of these perceptions of morality have survived to this day. But where you're going to be voting for me is going to be on neuroscience. At the end of the round, he doesn't really have any good responses to this. All he says is that this doesn't explain the moral core. But yes, it does. The moral core that he talks about is actually based on emotions. As Ayala tells you that the reason why humans have this sense of morality in the first place is because they advance subjective value judgments. And these emerge from cortical limbic networks that are specifically associated with emotions. This demonstrates that the moral core that he talks about is actually dependent upon the emotions that people feel towards certain actions. But problematically, because people have different brains, they result in different moral emotions. And so that means that these are subjective to the individual. All he says is that psychopaths are affected by their environment. No, he provides absolutely no evidence for this. What Mole tells you, it's because of neurological abnormalities that are based in biology. And then furthermore, psychopaths want to live. Recognize that he's changing his entire argument at the last minute by shifting away from altruism and this moral core towards the idea that everybody wants to survive. This is entirely new, and you shouldn't consider that I have to respond to this. All I demonstrate is that people have a different sense of morality in terms of how they treat other people, and this depends on what their neurological understanding of emotions is. And because emotions are based on personal feelings, and this varies from individual to individual, once again, this code of conduct that is put forward by all rational persons simply does not exist, and I strongly urge you to negate.
Good debate.
Good round.
So to welcome the finalists of the Big Questions Debate for Introduction, we have on the affirmative code Q122, Neel Sadda from Flintridge Preparatory in California, coached by Maggie Woodward and Khamani Griffin. On the negative code Q151, Michelle Ma from Plano West Senior High School in Texas, coached by Kattie, Leito, and Robey, Holland. If either of you just completed the 9th, 10th, or 11th grade, would you please raise your hand? All right, congratulations on auto-qualifying to both of you in Big Questions Debate for next year's national tournament.
We'd also now like to congratulate the finalists of Big Questions Debate, a debate format supported by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. This year, students have grappled with complex worldview questions as they debate both sides of the topic. Resolved. Objective morality exists. Tournaments and classrooms that hold Big Questions debates are eligible to receive thousands of dollars per event. Thanks to the generosity of the John Templeton Foundation, the NSDA has given almost $1.5 million to speech and debate programs across the country since 2016. We're excited that the foundation will generously support Big Questions for another 2 years, creating continued opportunities for students to debate topics at the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology. You can host a Big Questions event at a tournament, school scrimmage, or classroom event. Please visit nsdabigquestions.org to find out more information. But this year, your winners in 2020 Big Questions Debate are semifinalist in 4th place, receiving a $2,500 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation, Cameron Green from Regis High School in New York, coached by Eric DiMichele. Semifinalist in 3rd place, receiving a $2,500 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation, Sarah Ragsdale from North Kansas City High School in Missouri, coached by Amanda Dolinger and Sean Doherty. Placing 2nd and receiving a $5,000 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation is affirmative Neel Sadda from Flintridge Preparatory in California, coached by Maggie Woodward and Khamani Griffin. And your champion, receiving a $10,000 scholarship from the John Templeton Foundation and winning on a 4-3 decision, is the negative Michelle Ma from Plano West Senior High School in Texas, coached by Katie Leito and Robey, Holland.